Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History, which is the collaborative home to 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. Thanks to all of you for joining us this evening to hear about the new story collection, A Jewish Noir II. A few things before we get started. You'll notice the chat is disabled for participants, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. No need to raise your hand, and we'll get to the questions at the end. If you have any questions, you can type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded and should be available on the center's website and YouTube page within a few weeks. And since you registered for this event, you'll receive an email with the link to the recording when it's available. If you'd like to view the automated live captions at the bottom of the screen and you're not seeing them, just click on the CC button on the bottom of your screen. You should have already received a discount code for the book Jewish Noir II and its predecessor, Jewish Noir. Fantastic cover, by the way. I will put it again, the discount code in the chat tonight in case you don't have it accessible to you. That's 20% off. I'm going to chat with the authors and editors for a little while, and they'll chat with each other. And then we'll go to the audience questions. I'm going to keep the introductions brief because there are so many people to introduce. So I'll start with Kenneth Wishnia, who's one of the editors, as well as a contributing author to the collection. His novels have been nominated for the Edgar, Anthony, and Macavity Awards and have made best of the year lists at Booklist, Library Journal, the Jewish Press, and the Washington Post. He edited the Anthony Award nominated anthology Jewish Noir. He teaches writing and literature at Suffolk Community College on Long Island. Chantelle Aimée Osman is the other co-editor of this collection. She is the editor of Agora, an imprint of Paulus Books, which focuses on crime fiction with unique social and cultural themes. The former editor-in-chief of RT Book Reviews magazine. She is also an instructor at the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, Authors at Large, and Lit Reactor, and was named a Publishers Weekly Rising Star honoree in 2020. Robin Hemley is the author of 14 books of fiction and nonfiction, and his work has won a number of awards, including fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, 3 Pushcart Prizes, the Nelson Algren Award for Fiction from the Chicago Tribune, and many others. A number of his stories have been read on NPR, including Hanukkah Lights and Selected Shorts. His most recent book is Borderline Citizen, Dispatches from the Outskirts of Nationhood. He is co-founder of Authors at Large and lives in Iowa City, Iowa. Rabbi Eileen Schneider is a retired Jewish educator and hospice chaplain. She was one of the first women rabbis ordained in the US. She is the author of the award-winning Rabbi Aviva Cohen Mysteries. She also wrote Talk Dirty Yiddish and edited recipes by the book Oak Tree Authors Cook. Dr. Donna Maria Bivens-Smith, who writes under the name D.M. Evans, is a licensed psychologist with a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. Her latest nonfiction work is Control Your Crazy, Work the Good, Tame the Bad and Ugly. She is currently working on a novel, Return to Murder, a mystery set in 1980s New York City, and she lives in the Atlanta metro area. Shu Si is an Indonesian Chinese novelist, fiction writer, and essayist from Hong Kong, author of 15 books, including Monkey in Residence and Other Speculations, and This Fish is Foul, Essays of Being. She also co-authored The Art and Craft of Asian Stories. Co-founder of Authors at Large, she is currently William H.P. Jenks Chair in Contemporary Letters at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. So, did I get all of you?
Yes, you did.
Okay, so I just want to start it off maybe with the editors to ask, how did this series come about? I know this is the second collection.
Okay, I guess I'll start. I don't know, am I coming through everything good there? You can hear me well. I'm sure there's going to be some glitches because we heard some from you. It actually started with another author, and some of you might know him, a Jewish author, Reid, Farrell, Coleman. We were in an Akashic Noir collection together, Long Island Noir, and I actually had him as a guest at my day job. Again, at Suffolk County Community College on Long Island, and 6 of the authors are going to be coming this semester. And yeah, just one day he just sort of went like, Queens Noir, Long Island Noir, the heck with that Jewish noir. We practically invented it, which is actually true. We'll discuss that separately. I'll say separately that most people are aware, if you're a film noir buff, you're probably aware that, one of the stylistic precursors to film noir was the German expressionist film of the 1920s and early 30s. But it's not an issue of, and that style sort of, influenced the next generation. All those guys came over here. They all came over. They were all refugees from Nazi Germany. Edgar G. Ulmer was a set dresser for the German film company. He fled, came here. So there's that. And so, yeah, we ended up doing it that way. Fritz Lang is Jewish. He was born Jewish. His mother converted to Catholicism when he was 10 years old, but he was born Jewish, damn it. And he did all these films and, then fled in 1933 to come here. So yeah, film noir, a huge contributor to American film noir vocabulary are the German Jews and the Austrian Jews who fled there and came here and brought it with them. So, that's my "we invented it" speech. So go on.
Did you want to add to that?
Maybe for this volume, Chantelle was pushing for this one. So Chantelle was pushing for volume 2. So let's turn it over.
I really was. I basically loved volume 1, and I thought that there was so much more to explore, as you can kind of see. I mean, the first volume was brilliant, but I thought opening it up a little bit more to, more international ideas of, what the Jewish noir would be so interesting. And I think it's proven that with all of the variety of contributors that we have, and just see, like, for example, in Sushi's story, we have a completely different take on a nation's Judaism. So I just thought it was really interesting, and I badgered Ken until he said, yes, please, let's do volume 2. And he was nice enough to ask me to help him. So
that sort of leads me to another question. How are you, when you were just selecting the stories, how did you define or decide what makes the story, Jewish? And also, how are you defining noir?
You want to field this one first?
Sure, I'll try. So, I mean, noir obviously has a very broad definition. I mean, Ken went into how we see it in films. I generally think of it as a story where a generally small decision snowballs into something that is completely insurmountable or an unavoidable bad finish. That's kind of my broad. I mean, you can go further with that. There's also a mood to it, a feel to it, especially in, noir films that Ken was mentioning. As for how we chose the stories, it was reaching out to a very broad variety of international authors and saying, what is your take on this? And trying to find some that were less common. And making sure those were included, because it's, we have a section about diaspora, and that's the thing, it is everywhere. And it's not all the same experience. And we really thought, Ken and I, that would be important to represent in this volume.
Okay, so maybe we should hear from all the authors. Obviously there are a lot more stories than this in the book, but if this is a nice sampling, if we could hear a little bit of the background about your story, what it's about and how it came about. Maybe we should just go in the order that I see you on my screen. Do you want to start, Eileen?
Certainly, thank you. I write cozy mysteries, so writing a noir and a short story way outside my comfort zone. I met Ken at Left Coast Crime, I think Vancouver.
Yeah,
It's a long time ago now. pre-COVID,
2019, yes.
found out that he was putting together a second volume, and thought, well, we give it a try. Just I was brainstorming with some friends who do write short stories and quite prolifically. And one of them said, what about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire? And I went, oh, interesting idea. And it took off from there. What would happen nowadays, current times, if someone who had a connection to that fire through a relative became obsessed by it? And it was very difficult, very, very difficult for me to write. It went through, I think, 4 revisions before Ken finally said, you got it. It has to do with obsession. It has to do with revenge. It has to do with, I suppose you could almost say, a sort of a generations long memory, which I think we all know the Jews have, holding grudges, and also with sort of crime and punishment. Who should be? Should the children take on the sins of their fathers, or should they not? Should they be absolved for them? So all of those go into what is a short story. Some heavy themes. I did manage to get a little bit of my kind of trademark snarkiness and dark humor, which I use in my cozies as well, a few little asides. And it just finally gelled. And it gelled on 2 things that really, 3, I guess, that really made it gel. One is all my short, not all, most of the very few short stories I've done are in third person, and I wrote this in third, and it just was not flowing. I switched to first person, and it just poured out. The second was coming up with an opening line that would grab people, and the third was an ending that was not being led up to. So it kind of took the story where it seemed to be going into what was kind of a maudlin kind of redemption, forgiveness story, and flipped it right over to the opposite.
Yeah.
And those are what made the story finally come together. And
Yeah,
for
it's very
Ken,
twisty
it
and
comes with
dark.
Reid. It's very dark.
Thanks. Robin, do you want to tell us about your story?
Yeah, sure. I should start off with a little bit of my background because it sort of influences the story. I was born in Manhattan, and my parents were both translators, and in my father's case, the main editor of Isaac Bashevis Singer. And so I grew up very much in a household that was influenced by Singer and by those kinds of stories. But I left when I was 5. We moved to Southern Ohio, and my family was very secular at the time. But I would spend all my summers back in Long Island, in Long Beach, New York, where my grandmother had a beach house. And it was a very sort of working class beach community, and a little rough and tumble. And there was this woman on our street who would yell at us all the time when our Spalding balls would go in her flower bed. And she called herself Lady Calvert. And the story was that she had been a showgirl in Niagara Falls and had married, had gone to bed with the heir to the Lord Calvert whiskey chain, and woke up, and he woke up apparently married to her. And the family wasn't pleased, so they said, well, you can keep the title as long as we annul the marriage. So she insisted on being called Lady Calvert. So I thought, someday I have to work her into a story. And then my grandmother had these upstairs tenants. One was a homicide detective named Frank Siriani and his wife Joanne. And Frank one day showed me this photograph of this person he said was a very bad man who lived at the end of the block. And he said, by no means are you to say hello to this person or make eye contact or anything. He's very bad. And of course, that sat with me for many years. And I just imagined, well, what if I had? And I was also a bit of I was always involved in little petty thievery back then, stealing $1 from my grandmother's purse or something like that. And one time the neighborhood kids and I wanted to kind of break into this abandoned house, which, well, we thought it was abandoned. I actually went away before they went into it. But again, I imagined, what if I had participated? So I just put all of those things together.
Interesting. Sue?
There.
Hi, well, as you can see, I'm probably the least Jewish, one of the two non-Jewish people in this collection. Chantelle had asked me if I would contribute something, because she's part of our network in Authors at Large. And I thought, Jewish noir? So I had to put together, I'm not really a noir writer, but I've been in a couple of noir books before, in Manhattan noir and in Hong Kong noir. And so I looked at these two things and thought, well, that's a challenge. What can I write? And so, similar to Robin, I grew up in a kind of mixed up household. My family is from Indonesia, but I was born and raised in Hong Kong. So we're the overseas Chinese, we're a group known as the Huaqiu or Huaqiao diaspora from Southeast Asia in Hong Kong and around the world, actually. And we often get referred to as the Jews of Asia. So, hey, there's a little bit of a connection right there. And of course, I've lived much of my adult life in both Hong Kong and New York. And, as an adult, I met a lot of Jewish people in Asia and in China and in Hong Kong. A lot of the sinologists actually were Jewish. And so I thought, there's this whole Jewish community that is in Hong Kong that I hadn't really thought a whole lot about. But interestingly, my parents had one set of friends. Well, the husband was Jewish, although he was sort of secular and we wouldn't have known very much. But my father always used to refer to him as a Jew and called him an Ashkenazi Jew, which as a kid, I had no idea what he was talking about. His wife was Portuguese. And I mean, his son and I grew up together. So I just knew that they were these odd people, but they were Catholics like ourselves. So we had that as one side of it. And then, so this idea that my father said Ashkenazi, and I thought, well, I'll look that up. And interestingly, I was reading a book called Reid, A History of the Redhead by Jackie Collis Harvey. And I always had a fascination with redhead because it was something so unusual in Hong Kong. In fact, as a child, I had this imaginary friend who had red hair and green eyes. I think she was Irish, but I didn't know at the time. And in Jackie's book was a reference to the Ashkenazi Jews as one of the groups that had reddish hair. So I've got reddish hair, Ashkenazi Jew, and what can I have happen that is noir? Well, something that did happen that is from my background. Both my parents died at home in Hong Kong. And when somebody dies at home, it becomes a major police investigation. And I've gone through this process twice. And it's actually, on some level, kind of funny. So I thought, well, I can use that. So I thought I can borrow on that. And then the other thing I had was this strange couple who lived next door to us for much of my parents' time in this building that they lived in. And they were actually not Jewish at all, but I thought I can make them Jewish because they were a mixed race couple. The wife was Japanese or part Japanese, and the husband, I think, was Australian. But they were odd, the way my family was odd, the way the Indian family 2 floors down was odd. So I thought, well, let's have a death happen in the building, and maybe that could be the start of it. And the thing that was interesting about this couple was that I knew everything about them through the domestic helpers that my mother had, because the domestic helpers were all Filipino, and they were this huge network, and they would tell me all these stories, because I would talk to them since the Filipinos, in a way, many of them were Chinese Filipinos also who worked in Hong Kong. They were like me, also this Huachao or Wakyu group. And so we were all these oddballs in Hong Kong. And so I guess I wanted to write an oddball story. And so I gave them red hair. I gave the guy red hair. I had a death happen at home in a locked room, in a locked apartment, but everybody gossips about how it was a murder. And in a way, the story is a bit of a red herring. It's called rhododendrons because there's no reason that the police should think it's a murder. But of course, they're swarming around the buildings. And part of it is that for the local community, it's like they're Jewish, right? As if it's something weird. Because I grew up with that feeling all my life in Hong Kong. So I wanted to impart some of that into this story. So that's kind of where it came from. And the one other thing too that was interesting about the building that my parents were living in at that time is it's the building that Bruce Lee died in. So that's one of those mythologies, that was part of our building. So I thought, we have all these people dying in my building. Let me do something with that. And that's really how the story came about. It was the challenge of trying to write something Jewish and noir and to sort of reflect on the idea of how somebody who is sort of a little bit outside the main community of a place can sometimes be ascribed all kinds of weird and mysterious things that have nothing to do with who they are at all. And so that's kind of where that came about.
Well, that distrust of outsiders really does come through in your story, I would say.
Thank you.
Ken, you want to tell us about your story?
Oh, well, I've got so many comments to what everybody just said, but which I'd love to. I'm going to hog a few minutes at some point and do that. But yeah, mine is actually, I'll just say very briefly. So first of all, we actually adopted a very generous, you don't have to be Jewish to write Jewish noir for the first volume and for the second, and you see that happening, even though it's a majority. I also just I should have started with this. I just want to say thank you. Okay, we know, right, Chantelle? We know there are thousands of books you could have chosen, thousands. So we really appreciate that you gave us some attention to this. And so I'll just say really briefly, if we have some more time later, I can go into it, but marrying a Catholic got me interested in Jewish studies. I also come from a very secular family. My parents are basically Marxist atheist Jews, that brand of American Judaism. And marrying a Catholic, I was like, ooh, I better learn about the New Testament. I'm going to read it. And I read it and I was like, I know all this stuff. I knew everything about the life of Jesus, every major event in Jesus' life I know, just by growing up in the US. And I went, I don't know my own culture. I'm going to read the Hebrew Bible. And I went to a religious store and got a Hebrew Bible to take with me to Ecuador, which I read while going to mass with my wife the years of our marriage. I'm sitting there in Calvert in Ecuador, flipping through. And this is really translation, which it does obscure meaning. It's beautiful. Again, my day job's, I'm a literature professor. Says my connection's unstable here, but I hope there aren't too many glitches. So I'll just repeat. The book I had no notes, no explanation, and it was kind of a King James translation. So it was really hard to understand the stuff going through it the first time. And when I was in Judges, there's these astonishing acts of violence that just sort of jump out. You're reading what we went to see King Eglon, and then we stabbed him, and and he was so fat, the fat closed over the knife, and you're like, what? Who killed who for what reason? I've got to go back over. And yeah, I was just reading along, and there were just four verses where suddenly this astonishing act of violence by Yael, and I was like a kind of obsession again. I'm like, I have to develop this story. I have to expand it. And at the time, I did not have the background to do that. And so recently, over the past several years, I'm working on a novel where a huge section of it takes place in 538 BCE. And so yeah, a few people have written about the Bible before me, so I figured I'd better know what I'm talking about. And I just did this deep dive and spent about a year and a half just reading the Torah and a shelf of commentaries from, the feminist rabbis, 54 essays on every portion of the Torah to, the ultra Orthodox black hat guys in Brooklyn, and just read them all. And then went on to the rest of the Bible. And so I finally had the background. So just for example, so it's the story of Yael, and, among other things, what struck me was she has no motive for what she does. She's not an Israelite. You keep looking for clues. Why does she do this? But the research, for example, allowed me to discover Nomad Culture. And so, I didn't know this, and you can't understand the 4 little verses without knowing that, because, they're migrants, they're sorry, not migrants, transhuman migrants. And so they live in tents. And so apparently, if you're in tents, well, if somebody comes and grabs a hold of your tent ropes and asks for asylum, you have to grant it, But the rules are, but then you don't make any demands. You're a guest, they're protecting you. So, when Cicero walks into the tent and says, get me some water, it's like, wait, you're disrespecting our culture. You wouldn't know that just from reading those verses. So yeah, I had to do all this background and fill it in. And but another thing that's really striking about that section, and I do emphasize this, is, I also, learned in my research that, actually calling it judges is not a great translation. Shoftim really means chieftains, which gives you a much better sense of, gee, it's obviously a tribal period in Israel history. Chieftains are running things. So, we're told in the King James Bible, deliberately translated for Christian readers, that Deborah's a judge. It's like, Deborah's a chieftain. Wow. And it even says she led Israel at this time. I'm like, whoa, she led Israel. She was a chieftain and she led Israel. Could we hear some more about her? And there's only a little bit in there. So I've always been fascinated by female power in my stories. I've written 5 novels published 5 novels with female protagonists and 1 with a male protagonist. And my novel in progress, sitting with a publisher right now, is also female protagonist. So for whatever reason, the female voice comes more easily to me. So there you go. There's my pitch.
Okay, and Maria.
Yes, here I am. I just am so floored to be here with such accomplished and amazing authors. I thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this. Ken, I happened to be at the right place at the right time at Left Coast Crime in Vancouver when Ken was talking to some other authors, and he looked over at me and said, Maria, would you like to be in it? And I'm like, Jewish noir, huh? Well, I grew up in Flushing, New York. Okay, I'll do it. And I figured, I had nothing to lose. I grew up in a neighborhood that was an experiment in New York City, a project, a federal project that many Jewish people had come to from after the war and made their home. People who had been in the Holocaust, families, and it was called Pomanak, which I used the name in the short story. And the project was meant for people to transition into their own homes, but never really to live there permanently. But many people never left. And so my parents sent me to Catholic school, and I was always so jealous of my friends who were my neighborhood friends who went to the public school, because they would come back and tell me that, I went to Stacy's bar mitzvah and Mitch's bat mitzvah. I have it backwards. And I would get so jealous because they would have these parties and I wouldn't, I had confirmation and there was no party associated with that. So I'm like, having this opportunity, I got to jump into my friend's skin and participate as an outsider, because they were outsiders and I was an outsider, but I got to participate in my story from their stories that they told me. And I also participated in the story as an observer and with my relationships with people who were my neighbors. You know, in a project, you're like 2 feet from the other person's front door. So you walk out your apartment and bam, you're right there. So every day I was interacting with people who were different, and many Jewish people. And so when I grew up, I would see the mezuzahs on the door and I wanted one. I'm like, hey mom, why can't I have this decoration on the door? And she's like, no, that's not what you do. This is for Jewish people. So for a long time, many of the people that I knew weren't really strict Jewish people. I'm not sure what was going on in Pominock, but I didn't see a lot of the cultural aspects. Like if you went into Manhattan and you saw people, the Orthodox Jews, or people going to Sabbath on Saturdays. That was odd when I look back that didn't happen. Like a lot of people perhaps were losing their culture or hiding their culture. But I tried to incorporate that with some of my characters in the book, how they lost some of their past and lived mostly in the present. So with my main character and her roommate, they have experienced a lot of trauma. Her friend is a veteran and she has experienced great loss in her life, being an orphan and other tragic losses. And everyone lives in the present, but this present causes them to, this present and in the here and now. And I'm a psychologist and I look at these things through this lens, just living in the here and now without pulling on any experience from your past just tends to cause a lack of insight. And so they kind of stumble through life and it causes a lot of drama, constant drama in their lives. So I looked at this story and looked at my experiences and the experiences of my friends. And one of the things that's, I think you can relate to as a Catholic, guilt. So I think we can all relate to the guilt thing, which is not generic to Catholics. It's very prevalent in our religions and in Jewish religion, guilt. And so the story really is of guilt, penance, and vicarious retribution. So the characters get involved in what appears to be a possible murder, and it takes them down some paths that really stress their relationships. And the relationships in the book is what they use to survive. So my psychology background comes into this to not only relate to the characters with their empathize with the characters and have some compassion with the characters by looking at all of their actions as a means to just surviving the day-to-day tragedies of life.
Ken, you mentioned you had some other questions for the authors, your fellow authors.
Sure. Well, first, man, we should have copyrighted guilt, because you Catholics would be paying us so many royalties now, man. We just, anyway. But well, sure, there's a lot going on. So first of all, for people watching, yeah, some of the definitions of noir, you're going to say absolutely align with the Jewish experience throughout history. Oh, there's the person who just doesn't feel at home in the world. Oh, can't really put my foot down somewhere that feels like I belong. That's a noir motif. Oh, gee, I'm being persecuted for no particular reason. That's a noir motif. I think you can all right. Obsession that several of the authors mentioned. is certainly in there. That's not particularly Jewish, but certainly it's one about outsiders. A bunch of you mentioned it. And, one thing that really struck me, so I was interested in Shushi's experience, especially because, just for example, okay, yeah, in 586 BCE, the Babylonians invade Judea, destroy the temple, and huge sections of the Jewish population are sent into exile in Babylon, which is in what is now Iraq. They stayed there. Some came back, but they wrote the Babylonian Talmud there 1,000 years later. So they had to be a huge rabbinic academy there, right? The Palestinian Talmud, also called the Jerusalem Talmud, is considered, less important. So it's Babylon is the center of rabbinic studies 1,000 years later. So obviously the Jews stayed there, a lot of them. And when do they all get kicked out? 1948, when Israel defeats its Arab, invaders and, declares independence. And so, the rulers of Baghdad say, okay, Jews out. So, just imagine this for a moment. We lived there for 2,500 years and we're still considered outsiders. So yeah, so that's noir. And, how do you do that? Jews were in Germany over 1,000 years, yet still considered outsiders. That's one reason I'm an American. You come here, you take the oath, you're American. That's great. So I was curious about Shushi's because, you do say, okay, yes, there's the local attitude about anyone different. So I was curious about that because, again, yes, Lord knows we have our problems with prejudice and racism in the United States, but at least the theory, and I certainly have subscribed to it, is, hey, you're born here, you're American. Your family came here yesterday, but you're born here, you're American. And, places like Germany, Italy, old cultures, they really can have this attitude. Like, if you can't trace your lineage back to some, Gothic tribe that settled the land around the Rhine, in the 4th century BCE, you're not German. We all know Turkish guest workers went there in the 50s, and their grandchildren, second generation born there, but not really considered German. Certainly not ethnically German, in a way that the U.S. is really different. So yeah, I was curious. In Shushi's story, she does say, among other things, that there's this local attitude towards anyone different. And so I was curious to hear more about that. Is it as serious as the German example, where like literally we were there 1,000 years and we're still considered foreigners?
Well, actually, in Hong Kong, it's kind of the opposite. It's such a young, not country, but city, really, as far as its modern state. And, everybody is pretty much a migrant who came there. All the Chinese who came, who fled the communist government and came to Hong Kong are only there, 3 generations would be a long time in Hong Kong. I mean, my father's family in Indonesia, they left from China, from the southeast coast of China to Indonesia, were there 7 generations. So this is the interesting thing, yet so quickly the groups form. So the Cantonese are the dominant group. So, that's one kind of Chinese dialect, which is different from, my father was Chinese educated, but he was Mandarin educated. And he came, and we're not Cantonese, we're Fujianese. So right away, we're that smaller group. And there are Indian families who have been in Hong Kong for several generations, who are still always considered outsiders. And forget the Filipinos. I mean, because they came in under a domestic helper visa, they're discriminated against even legally as well. They cannot become permanent residents, whereas if you're a white person, you come in no problem. but not if you're Irish. Now you can, but not before, not when there was a British colony. So there were all these different layers of it. You know, we had the British colonial layer, we had the local Cantonese hierarchy there. And then you had people like my parents who were just kind of like, hey, everything goes. I mean, my father was doing manganese trading with Indonesian and Japanese. So we had Japanese friends, we had Portuguese friends, we had Filipino friends, we had Welsh friends, and in my household, it didn't matter what the color of your skin was or what language you spoke, but it was not the case in school, and it was not the case in society there, because especially because I was growing up in the colonial era, you know, there was the British world and there was the Chinese world, and I was something in between. So I had a lot of empathy and sympathy for anybody who was different. So immediately, if somebody was not like everybody else and the local community had something to say about it, I would always be on their side. So very early on, I kind of felt that because I knew that we were outsiders. But you see, the thing is, outsider is such a silly sort of term because, I mean, I speak Cantonese like a native speaker, you know, so I mean, I can sound very local, but it doesn't change. It really doesn't change. But then, of course, the same was true for the Chinese, say, in Indonesia. They could have been there for many generations. And like my mother's family, they barely spoke any Chinese at all. They spoke Indonesian. And yet they're still seen as Chinese. Part of it is that they consider themselves more Chinese and they don't want to intermarry and all the rest of it too. But that's all myth because we're all mongrel anyway. So.
Okay. Are we?
Ken, I know you had some questions for the other authors as
Oh,
well. I have
sure. Okay.
questions for all of you, but do you want to direct some more questions first?
Well, let's hear from you.
Okay.
Let's hear from you. Go ahead. Are
I
you
know,
freezing
Ken, that your story was set in ancient Israel, and you were talking about all the research you did, and just asking because I'm representing the Center for Jewish History. For the rest of you, was there any aspect of research or historical research that went into your story, or was it more, seems like for a lot of you, it's sort of more personal or based, you know, that came out of your own experiences? Go ahead, Eileen.
I did some research. I knew a lot about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, but I did check things like the exact number of young women who died in the fire, the exact date. So there were details that I did look up what's being done in terms of memorials and how they, and what's done annually to commemorate what happened. So there were things that I did check on. It was not as detailed research as, for example, the Ken had to do. But just to fact check what I was writing.
I usually do a lot of research in my work, but in this one, it was mostly memory and imagination. Although there was one thing that I researched, and that was the whole Lord Calvert thing, because I had grown up thinking that this story was true, that this woman had married Lord Calvert and then this had been annulled. And then I found out, I did a little research and found out that Lord Calvert was a PR invention by a whiskey company and that he didn't even exist. So I have no idea what the real story was, but that was what I grew up with. And so I actually like not knowing, but I thought that was funny that everyone on the block was fooled by this story.
I definitely had to do some research. I wanted, number one, to make sure when I spelled the word, it was spelled correctly. And the other big piece of research, I didn't research extensively, but with the role of women prison guards in concentration camps. There's a character who has some background of this, and I wanted to make sure that my ages were coherent, and were there women who were actually prison guards. And I found about the information about the young women, teenagers who were prison guards in charge of dogs who were as vicious as the men were. And so doing that research, I initially had a feeling of, wow, people get conscripted into these roles unwillingly, but then it becomes who they are, and they become as capable of atrocities as a grown person. So it was an interesting bit of understanding of history and human behavior.
Chantelle,
Well, actually, I was going to jump in anyway for a second,
Oh,
Lauren,
great, go
because on the history question, it's one of the things that I absolutely love about this volume is because I think, I mean, so much of, especially like what you all do at the center, but so much of the history is memory and family and recording. And so what I really love, especially with this group, you know, it's they're drawing from their own memories and their own, you know, history and these stories that they grew up with. And I felt like that also represented the core ethos in such a way. And I also wanted to say on the history front, that's one of the reasons Ken and I get along so well as co-editors and friends. I was, right before I went to law school, I was starting a degree in comparative religious studies. And so this has always been a very fascinating subject to me anyway. And the number of times that Ken and I have shared, you know, late night wine and talking about really obscure religious history is legion. So I like that we get to talk about that in this context too.
And who are you seeing as sort of the ideal reader for this collection, or if there is such a thing?
Well, I mean, honestly, to me, clearly any reader is the ideal reader, but I would like the ideal reader to be somebody who might not normally pick up a volume like this, or was expecting something different and got so many more new perspectives, different perspectives, angles on things, learned from it. So, I mean, any reader is ideal. And of course, everyone in the audience is the best reader. But I just really think that there's so much to appeal in a mainstream way about this anthology. And there's so much, you know, good to be taken away from it.
Are you thinking there'll be a volume 3 at this point?
I mean, it's a lot of work, but several authors, when this came out, said, "Oh, when's volume 3 coming out?" You know, and I had some people who promised me for the other. The curious thing, I will say that volume 1, it was pre-pandemic, and we ended up like this traveling band. We had so many events all over the country, and it was like we were all going together, and there was a tremendous sense of community. You know, unfortunately, this is pandemic now. We're doing virtual. I haven't even met some of the contributors in person. I hope maybe we do that. But you know, at some point at some of these events. But you know, Robin Hemley was mentioning this lady Calvert. Turns out not even to be real. Lord Calvert. Noir II, somebody who's like, nope, I'm gonna stick to this delusion, you know. So that's there. But yeah, you know, I certainly did a lot of research. Again, I would say, you know, again, gee, with the Marxist atheist parents, I'm, you know, skeptical of some biblical claims, but you know, at this point, you know, in the story of Yael, in the book of Judges, it says iron technology has come to the Philistines, i.e. the coast people, the sea people, which would make sense. A new technology would come to the coastal people first. And that it says in the Bible at that point, and they were blockading the hill country of Judea. They didn't want iron technology going up there. And so, you know, so I'm thinking, great, so the Israelites have got like old bronze weapons, you know, they literally have, you know, the Bible describes shields made of wood with, you know, leather stretched over them. And I'm thinking, oh, that's great. You got the enemy with 900 iron chariots, it says in the text. And, you know, you've got like bronze or something. So, you know, that set that up. So yeah, I would just say that makes sense. That sounds historically accurate. That, you know, again, a new technology would reach the coastal people first, and they wouldn't want them to get that. So, but for some reason, they allow this traveling band of iron workers, and Yael is one of those. So sure. What do you talk about here? One thing that really struck me in our story about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, I guess if my parents are actually in the audience here, I can't tell. I would be amiss if I didn't say that my mother's father actually witnessed the fire. He came here at 14 in 1909. No family here, just a kid. Apparently, he got hired by a newspaper to deliver papers or be a copy boy, certainly, which in those days meant drive the horse cart uptown. You literally would go and collect the copy from a reporter. And yeah, one day in the spring of 1911, he was told, head up to Washington Place. It's a story. And it was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So he was maybe 16 and witnessing, you know, young girls his age jumping out of windows. And so, yeah, my mom says it turned him into a unionist. He realized the bosses don't care if we burn to death. You know, we've got to do this. And, you know, so yeah, there's a personal element even in that. But I guess, you know, the character in that sort becomes very obsessed because, I won't give away too much, but you know, an ancestor of hers was actually performed heroic actions, you know, in that. And also of Robin's story, because what struck me about it, you know, the question I wanted to raise, which you could answer, is just, you know, we're only a generation past the end of World War II, a generation past the Holocaust, and yet the family depicted, kind of similar to mine in that way, has almost no connection to Judaism. You know, they lose count of them, and you know, the candles when they're doing the Hanukkah menorah, and they go, let's just do like, is it the 7th? Or, you know, let's just do 2. You know, and we're told that he's not even sure his grandma even bought candles this year. And so I guess the issue there is, you know, on the one hand, the United States is very welcoming, you know, I'm alive because my grandparents made it here. And yet, you know, there's this tremendous pressure to assimilate, to leave the other culture behind. And, you know, something is lost there. Like I had to turn as an adult to go study and look at my own culture. So, yeah, so this is for either Rabbi S there or Robin, if you wanted to respond to just, you know, again, in Robin's story, how the family is Jewish in name only, you know, they basically know nothing. And that phenomenon, but also, you know, in the Triangle, one thing that struck me was, you know, the impossibility of living up to our immediate predecessors, you know, people who fought and died, you know, so that we could be here. And, you know, it's impossible. We can't do that.
I think with every, I'm sorry,
Eileen,
Kenneth.
are you?
Yeah, sure. I think with just about every immigrant group that has voluntarily come to the United States, there's this urge that the next generations will be more successful, whether that means higher status careers, whether it will mean they will be more wealthy, however success is going to be determined. And I'm sure there was some of that pressure on my protagonist, but a lot of it for her was an internalized one of, I cannot possibly live up to this example that my parents want me to live up to. There was no way that I can do it. And it sort of ate away at her. Now she had mental health issues, obviously. And that just sort of exacerbated the things that she was feeling already, was this burden she had of living up to this example of her great I don't remember whether it was great or great grandmother to be as heroic and outstanding as she was, and just can't do it. And it eventually just eats away at her. And it really injures her psyche even more than it already is from her having had, for whatever causes, other psychological mental health issues. But I found myself, while writing it, thinking a lot of, well, what happens with these second, now third generation, fourth generation survivors? The children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren now of Holocaust survivors. And how do they deal with this burden? And it's something that I can't answer. As far as I know, I have no relatives at all who are still in Europe and perished or suffered at all from the Holocaust. So I have no way of knowing, just from speaking with people, from reading things, knowing that there are psychic burdens that do get passed down through the generations. And I was thinking about, does that happen? We is there still this need that some have, that we have to do something to get back at the Germans? Or is it more of a, certainly it's not a forgive and forget, but okay, that's what happened in the past. Germany has faced it. Whether or not we accept their reparations, apologies, whatever, is irrelevant. They made that effort towards atonement. Does that affect these people who were personally, and whose ancestors were personally affected by those events? And certainly all Jews as one people, regardless of where we're from or what our religious beliefs, have been affected by those events. And I don't have an answer for it. I'm just sort of throwing that out also as something I was thinking of when I had my protagonist plotting out her own scenario for revenge.
Robin, did you want to reply to Kenneth? And then maybe I'll ask
Sure.
one final question and we'll go to a couple of audience questions.
Sure, I'll answer briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think negotiating one's relationship to Judaism is and Jewish heritage and culture and history. That's all a really alive thing in certainly my family. We were fortunate enough to, on both sides of my family, to have come to the U.S. Before the Holocaust. And I think that my parents were much like yours, Ken, in that they were Jewish intellectuals and artists, and were very assimilated in that way, though just one generation back, their grandparents were, very observant. And of course, like so many Jews in America, so I grew up secular, but have am much more observant than I was as a kid. But my brother has moved to Israel, made Aliyah, and gone and lives in Rehovot, Israel, and is very, Orthodox. So that has been, that's a tension that I think is both very dramatic sometimes, but it can also be comical. And I was trying to explore the sort of comic effect of that, of a family that was so disorganized and chaotic that they would use table candles for the menorah, or whatever was handy, or just would forget. Because that's certainly been something in that would have happened in my family too.
It seems like there are some aspects of some of these stories that speak particularly to the current moment. So this is for anybody. How do you feel like this book really speaks to our current moment in history?
I don't know, maybe someone else. I'll just briefly say, the opening and closing stories deal with the rise of, white supremacist violence, and that's a factor out there. I'm not I don't be super alarmist about it, but it's extremely disturbing, what we're seeing out there. The parallels aren't 100%, but, we seem to have a sociopathic demagogue who's got a bunch of devoted fans who are ready to take up their arms and kill anyone that this person points them towards. And let's just say Jews have never been in the position of being able to say, oh, they're just coming for the gypsies, It's like, believe me, if they're coming for them, we're next, So yeah, there are a couple of stories that, do address that. And others are a lot of them are contemporary, but, slightly less existential issues going on there. But yeah, I literally start this collection and end the collection with extreme anti-Semitism. So
and I'll say that Ken and I both rewrote our introductions because this book was originally scheduled to be published, directly mid, lockdown. So we've pushed it a couple of times for obvious reasons. And he and I both have rewritten our parts of the introduction more than twice at this point, I think, because of, it was timely when we were doing it back in 2019, 2020. And it sadly became more and more and more timely and more relatable in a broader sense as the time went on. So,
yeah.
And I think also with today's world, mental health issues, substance abuse, PTSD, those are all in our face, and we're starting to discuss it and do something about it. Put more resources into helping people with mental illness, substance abuse problems. And I thought that was important to address.
Okay, so there are a couple of audience questions because we're coming up on over an hour. A couple of people are asking, will the books that I mentioned at the start be in the email? I'm guessing they mean the books that the rest that you have all already written. So I'd be happy to put that list in the email that gets sent out when the recording goes live. And this is a question for you, Ken. Ken is wearing a Kafka t-shirt. Would you say Kafka was one of the original Jewish noirists?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But also, we mentioned humor. A number of people mentioned humor and the absurd. And the folks who know Kafka know that he considered the Metamorphosis a comedy. That his friends laughed when he read it. But yeah, I was in Prague a few years back for research, so I've got my Prague Kafka t-shirt there. But absolutely, and of course his life was a Jewish noir life, so anyway, but yes, go ahead.
And there's a question about who is the femme fatale in Jewish noir, the Jewish mother?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I don't know that I have a really good answer because, like we said, there's such a broad definition of noir. And I think a lot of, clearly a lot of stories, Philip Marlowe, et cetera, they have a femme fatale. But I think it's kind of a side thing and not a linchpin that necessarily defines noir itself. I suppose if I had to pick, just doing a super deep dive to quote Ken on this one, who would be the femme fatale in our anthology? It would probably be just the attraction of secularization and the American dream. That's our femme fatale in this story.
By the way, Lauren Bacall was Jewish.
There you
And
go.
Can't
There's
really
our
think of noir
fatale.
without
Lots of yeah. Oh no, and Shelley Winters and lots and then but okay, I'm just blanking. Lilith is a femme fatale, and I will say that I did not want any paranormal stuff in the original Jewish noir because somebody had submitted a paranormal Holocaust, and I was like, don't do not do that. But Lilith, I was like, yes, so she is truly a femme fatale. So yeah, she's in the story.
So maybe we should.
Lilith.
leave it there.
There's
I
the
want to
fun
thank you all for.
Looks like folks are
participating.
freezing.
Yeah,
Is it
sorry,
me?
Ken, you're freezing. We're coming up on over an hour, so, and this has been a great discussion. Thank you all for joining us. And I did put the link in the chat if you'd like a discount on the book. And good night, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Great to see
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you in
Bye.
person.